Hi, my name is Ellie, and this is my presentation on revenge, or more specifically, how the theme of revenge is represented in Chinese and American film. If you don't know what revenge is the action of inflicting hurt or harm on someone for an injury or wrong suffered at their hands. Now, probably you did know what revenge is, because I would say that this is a universal theme. Pretty much anywhere you go in the world or anyone you talk to will understand the concept of revenge. This is something that even if you go back thousands of years in history, we still see evidence that humanity has a tendency towards wanting to hurt someone who hurt them. In fact, if we look in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, which, was written thousands of years ago, it says, "But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot." It even keeps going from there. Um, but this idea is so common throughout the history of humanity since probably the dawn of time. Um, so the question is, why is this something that we look for? And I think the reason is because we all have a desire for justice. We have a desire for wrongs to be set right. And so, even as you read this in the Bible verse, it's the idea that there's an equal exchange of harm that is done to each other. However, why is there this difference between justice and revenge? I think for most of us growing up, justice is like this great good thing, and then revenge is this like evil thing. But if you look at them, they seem actually quite similar. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go in and kind of discuss the idea of whether or not justice is better than revenge after all, or if they're essentially the same. But before we get into that, I wanted to dig into a little bit more of what is revenge. And we're going to see this represented today through a couple of films. Unsurprisingly, there are a lot of movies on revenge. It's a pretty common theme. As I said, it's a universal theme. I think we all experience this desire. And so it's not surprising that a lot of movies have been made along the premise of someone hurt them and now they're going to hurt them back. This is just very few examples, but there are tons and tons of them. Even the idea of the Avengers is kind of based off this idea of revenge. You hurt me and now I'm going to go hurt you back. So what we're going to dig into today is we're going to talk about these two specific movies. So the first movie that we're talking about is Vengeance. This was made in 1970. It's quite a bit of an older movie, and it was directed by Chang Cheh. And this movie, not hard to figure out from the title, is very much a revenge story. We are following Xiao Lu as he seeks revenge on the men who orchestrated his brother's death. So it's very straightforward, very clear goals. These men kill his brother, and now his goal is to kill them back. It is about as straightforward of a revenge story as you can get. Even in the imagery of the picture, it's very clear what's happening. So we're going to contrast this movie with John Wick, which, not as obvious in the title, but pretty obvious in the premise, is also very much a movie about revenge. So this one was released in 2014, so a bit newer. It's still 10 years old, but a lot newer than 1970. And it was directed by Chad Stahelski. And these movies follow our protagonist, John Wick, as he seeks revenge on the men who killed his dog. So similar storyline. He is hurt by these things. They kill someone that he loves, or in his case, his dog. And he is now going back to exact revenge upon them. So very, very similar movies. They have some obvious differences. The main one being the background and setting of these films. So it's not very hard to tell, again, from the covers, but very different backgrounds happening in these films. Vengeance is set in, even though it's filmed in the 70s, it's actually set in the 1920s in China. I believe it's Peking in 1925. And so there's a much older feel to this film in general. It is set in China, so we have a lot more of the cultural Chinese background. One thing that I love about this movie is that we get this really cool connection to Chinese theater. Xiaolu's brother is, as you can see it in the picture, he's the performer. He's a martial artist performer. He performs in the theater. And I believe Xiaolu is also comes from similar performing background. So we get a very different feel in this film than we get in John Wick. John Wick is set in a bit more of a modern day New York underbelly. There's much more of a dark and kind of grim feel going around as he's doing things. It's a lot more modern technology, modern, even the way that they speak is very modern. And so it's very, very different feeling. Even in the music, when you watch these two movies, the colors and the music are really heavily contrasted from each other. Like I said, on one hand, we have this Chinese theater, we have a lot of traditional Chinese music, we have a bit more of a lively, colorful, upbeat feel in Vengeance, even though it is still dealing with those very deep, intense emotions, we get kind of a more bright expression of them. In John Wick, we get a lot more of the kind of spy, slick, smooth feel that I think is pretty common in Western action. So there's a pretty clear difference in the settings and the feels and the tones of these two films. The other thing that I find really interesting that's different between these two, which I think also comes down a lot to the cultural background, is the method in which these men choose to take revenge. It's really cool when you watch these films how drastically different it is the way that they fight. One thing that is really cool about Vengeance is that we get more of that wuxia background, kind of kung fu martial arts feel. And so almost throughout the entire film, he is either doing hand-to-hand combat or he's using knives. I don't even actually know if he ever really uses swords, but he uses a lot of knives, occasionally some rope. I think there's only one scene in the entire film where he actually uses a gun. Pretty much entirely, he's hand-to-hand combat, very close quarters, physical fighting. And this is a really stark contrast from John Wick, which is essentially the most American gun show film you could possibly get. John Wick almost entirely fights with guns throughout the entire film. I think only in the very last battle scene does he actually put the gun down and they have a fist fight. But it's almost entirely, like I said, a very American guns a-blazing. That's how they fight. And so it's a pretty interesting like contrast because they're doing the same thing. They have the same goals. They're killing pretty much the same amount of people. They wipe out tons of people in these movies, but the tactics are incredibly different because I think of that cultural background and that in China, the fist fighting kung fu martial arts, it's so exciting and it's such a beautiful part of their culture that if Xiao Lu had just used guns the entire film, would have taken away from kind of the heart of like what's going on. Whereas in John Wick, it makes sense because that's the culture that they're in. It's a culture where everybody has guns. This is what we're doing, right? So I thought that was a very interesting difference between these films. But like I said, these are actually incredibly similar movies. If you kind of stop to think about it, there's a lot of similarities. The first one being the kind of driving factor behind both of our protagonists is their pain. You may have noticed in the beginning when I talked about these movies that they're going through kind of different situations. One has just lost his only brother, and the other one has lost his puppy. Now, you may or may not think that that's an equal level of pain, but to give a little more context to what's going on, in John Wick, his wife has just passed away very recently, and his late wife gave him as a gift this puppy, kind of as a representation of the hope to continue living. And so this puppy is not just a dog, but it really is kind of the representation of the love of his wife, of the life that they had and the life that he can continue to have. And so when these men break into his house and they kill his dog and they steal his car, it's kind of like they take away everything from him. It's almost as if his wife is dying all over again. So the pain that both of our protagonists are feeling is really grief of losing a loved one. It's a very similar start in that they're just completely sold out going for revenge. There's nothing holding them back at this point because they've kind of lost everything. Another similar thing that I think is really cool about these two films is the skill levels of our two protagonists. They're both incredible fighters. It is very different because Xiao Lu he's a martial artist. I don't think he has a background in killing people, as far as I can tell. But he is an incredibly skilled fighter, and he is someone to fear and successfully takes out tons of men, right? John Wick, on the other hand, is an ex-assassin. He is a killer, and this is what he did. That's the background that he comes from. But again, they're very similar in their skill levels that when they come out to fight these men, everybody kind of knows, or we know as an audience when we watch them, that they're not to be messed with, that they're going to be able to do some crazy things to beat up a ton of people. So they're both very, very strong male fighter protagonists that we're following through this. And the main similarity, obviously, is their goals, which is to get revenge. But the thing I find really interesting about this, and I love um, this article, Circuitous Action, Revenge Cinema by Jean Ma, really worth reading. The thing that I absolutely love that she talks about in this is she talks about revenge being like a game of numbers. And I love that term. I don't know what you would call it, but I love that phrase that she uses there because you see it in both of these movies that there is the initial loss. So if we use vengeance as an example, there's the loss of his brother, and we have Xiao Lu, who has lost one person, one life, right? And so you would think that justice would dictate that one life equals one life. Now that his brother has died, he's going to go kill the person who killed his brother, and everything will be equal and settled, and we're good. But instead, what revenge does is revenge, instead of saying, you hurt me, so I hurt you, it says, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you worse. And so we see it in both of these films where damage is done to them, and their response is to do way more damage. It's an interesting parallel in the two movies because Xiao Lu's brother is killed by, or his death is orchestrated by four men who are under another guy, and Xiao Lu kills all of them and an entire other army of henchmen. Similarly, in John Wick, there's three men that kill his dog who work for another guy, and he kills all of them and their entire army of henchmen. So it's very similar in that these movies are just bloodbaths of our protagonists killing tons and tons of people who potentially didn't have anything to do with the actual crime that was committed in the first place. So, as Jean Ma talks about this in her article, the real issue with revenge is that instead of it making things equal, is that it creates a cycle where now everyone feels the need to do more harm and more harm and more harm, and to have the last word in this argument, right? Until eventually just everyone is dead. That is the thing that I feel personally that Vengeance got right over John Wick. Even though I absolutely love the John Wick movies, one of the biggest differences between these films is the ending. And this, like I said, I feel personally that Vengeance got right, is that in the end, they both of these characters go through this crazy journey of, fighting and killing all of these men and taking so much injury and damage throughout the film, where honestly, I don't know how they kept going. They probably could have died so many times throughout the movies. Um, but they go through all of these things, and in the end, John Wick just gets up and walks away. He kills everybody, he succeeds, he gets his revenge, and then he goes and he gets a new puppy that he saves from the kennel and he just walks off. And as a movie watcher, we love that because it's like, yeah, he did it. Like we root for him, you know? But it's not very realistic. Whereas when we watch Vengeance, there's this very real feel to it in that eventually the revenge catches up to him. He does it. He avenges his brother. He succeeds. He kills all these people. But in the end, he can't escape the consequences of his own actions. And so this for me, I felt was the big contrast that I thought was so interesting, is the contrast between fantasy and reality. It kind of made me think more and more about Chinese versus American films. And I think I've always kind of thought of these action movies as American films are a bit more realistic. If you take away like superheroes and stuff, if you focus on like the regular action, American films are relatively realistic. They use real weaponry that people would use, you know, they fight. It's a very real physical fighting. Whereas in a lot of Chinese films, we get that wuxia, you know, he'll jump and fly 200 feet and then punch the guy. And it's really awesome. It's the mythical fantasy of it all. Like we love it. It's so cool. But we know it's not reality. He's not really punching the guy and the guy dies immediately, you know. But the thing that I found so interesting when I was comparing these movies is the flip of fantasy because we go from, you know, the kind of unrealistic things that are happening in Chinese action films to what I personally think is the very real ending result. Um, to me, Vengeance is the more, in a weird way, realistic movie, even though it has so many over-the-top fighting scenes and like he's gutted open, but he's still fighting, you know, because in the end, reality catches up with him. And this is a very, like, the thing that I find so interesting about John Wick is what I think is a very Western cultural fairy tale ending, which I had never thought about before watching this movie. But he really does get the happy ending. He gets up and he walks away, when in reality, he probably shouldn't have been able to. But I think as a Western culture, we like that fairy tale ending so much that no one would have been satisfied if it just ended with him dying. Everybody would have been mad, right? So this is the one thing that I absolutely I love both of these movies, but I really strongly feel Vengeance got this one right in that revenge will catch up with you. The game of numbers, the circle of revenge will eventually catch up with you. And this brings me back to what I was talking about earlier of what is the difference between justice and revenge? The difference is revenge is a cycle, whereas justice is a balance. It's really interesting because even if we were talking about the Bible earlier, if you go back to the Bible later on, when Jesus comes, he says, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. And it's so weird because this is the same book, the same God that said, if they cut off your hand, cut off their hand, right? But I think it's the reality that as humans, as humanity, we don't tend to do well with equal pain. We tend to want to hurt back more. We tend to want to have that revenge. And in the end, that doesn't go well for us. It just starts that cycle again. And so instead, this is why we need law. We need a government or you know, something else that is doing the punishing for us. Because if we take justice into our own hands, it turns into revenge. So for me personally, I believe this is why justice is better than revenge. Because if we actually live in a world where you take an eye for an eye, we just all end up in a world that's blind. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.